Chapter 16, Center Point. In the blink of an eye, Amarok was no longer in the place that now seemed to be under attack. He was lying on the wooden planks of a room, looking up at the ceiling, with no idea where he was or how he got here. The male stood up and looked around the small room, spotting a table whose top bore the dark imprint of a hand. This color was also on the floor next to the table, but it had not dripped down from him, but someone or something must have left it there. He quickly grabbed his stomach, but found that he was unharmed. He realized that the open entrance door that let in the sunlight was smeared with this color, and it occurred to him that it could be blood. Fearfully he passed through the entrance and saw a strange red mass lying in the grass, around which the flies were gathering. It must have been a dead fox, only recognizable by the fur markings on its torn-apart muzzle. Cut up. Shredded. Gutted. His heart beat fast and the fear grew stronger. Who was this body and who had done this to him? What is this place? He asked himself, when suddenly a soft voice prompted him, "Go back inside. It's cold outside." Just as he was wondering what this was all about, after all, it was obviously a warm summer day, the wolf noticed that the sky was clouding over and it was suddenly bitterly cold. He shivered and his breath froze as he spotted more body parts scattered in the grass, one-eyed slain skulls, severed legs and arms, disemboweled bodies and charred remains. More and more of them crossed his gaze and he quickly realized that they must be exclusively wolves. It stank of burnt flesh and the air tasted metallic. The world turned gray and first small, then larger and larger snowflakes began to cover the carcasses and body parts when from somewhere a deep voice called out, "Amarok. There you are." It was Chenerah who came running toward him, delighted. "Chenerah. What's going on here? Where are we?" The wolf asked, confused, and took his friend in his arms. "Don't be scared, sweetie," the sheepdog reassured. "We've arrived at the center." Before the Samo could inquire further, he heard a familiar voice shouting, "I never wanted to kill my friend Joliad, but I wanted to kill you and your kin, you bastard." The wolf looked startled and asked, "Carteron? Surely that's not possible." He could even hear his own voice now, as it spoke tense and angry, "You are a fucking butcher. Chenerah. What is this place? Is Carteron here? Joliad, perhaps. How did we?" But the Alsatian shook his head. "Don't you remember the situation when you knelt on Carteron and rammed the knife into his body several times? What you just heard was your hateful dialogue with him." What knife?" "Well, that one," Gajaze said, pointing at Amarok's hand. The latter looked puzzled at his hand and actually held in it the hunting knife from before. It was covered in blood, and Amarok had no idea how it had suddenly gotten there. "Is this another one of those dreams, Chenerah?" he asked and looked up again, only to find that the person he was talking to had disappeared. The wolf looked around and turned in a circle when he saw a dark figure crouching on the ground. Slowly he approached it and realized from the side that it was a Samoyed Naramaran mongrel who was anxiously shivering, sniffling and calling for his mother, begging to wake up. Stunned, Amarok opened his eyes wide and knew immediately, he was at the source of the hatred of wolves and foxes for each other, and this creature was Banado. "This can't be happening," he whispered to himself and then developed unbridled rage. This hybrid was the trigger of all hatred in his world and he, Amarok, could put an end to it now, at its source. How he had come here, where he was, all that did not matter to him now. For now he was actually facing Banado, the one who had raped his own mother and thus had begotten the Aramarans of today. This had to be a distant scene from the past, and Amarok hoped that he had arrived at a point in time when evil had not yet run its course. So he grabbed the mongrel with a firm grip under his chin and lifted his head. "Yes, call for your mommy. Look, my friend. Look what the foxes have done. They killed all our families. All because your parents sired bastards." Amarok spoke angrily, his chaps tightened, holding his hunting knife with its wide blade and wooden handle. "Stand up and look at your outrages." "No," whimpered Banado. "I didn't do anything. Go away." Now Amarok screamed and was beside himself. "Yes, you did. Amma, Enna, Jack, Joliad. You allowed them to kill them all, and you're going to pay for it." "What is Amma, Enna, Jack, Joliad? What do these words mean?" sniffed Banado, now slumping down? He held his head in pain and screamed when suddenly Chenerah's voice rang out, shouting loudly, "Stop." Once again the dog had stopped time and tapped Amarok on the shoulder so that he could move again. "Chenerah," he said, "what is this now?" "My wolf, here I am again. How are you doing right now?" The Samoyeden looked at Banito, who was frozen and made a painful face, his muzzle torn open and saliva running out of him. "What do you think? I don't give a shit what kind of fiction you've built here again, but I'm going to destroy this bastard now so that peace can finally reign in my world. You know the building we were sitting in with Atamok, the president and Serena is under attack right now, right? Yes, and according to that, this must be a dream. I was hit by something. In the stomach. Am I dead?" The younger asked, and his counterpart just shook his head. "No, this is not a dream at all. I took you to the center of the Vulpes Lupus Canis to explain something to you." "No dream? All the better." The Samoyeden spoke quickly and lunged with a hunting knife to injure the immobilized Banito with it, which his friend, however, managed to prevent with a courageous grip on his arm. "No, Amarok," he ruled. "It's not going to work that way." "Oh, and why not?" the wolf asked incredulously. A pause arose in which he looked at the dog and silently held out his hand. Again, those Alsatian eyes looked and shone like radiant resin, casting a spell on him once more. "Explain it to me, please," he begged, now calm. His friend was able to point out something important to him. "Think about it. What else did you just say to Banito?" "I told him that he will pay for the death of my parents, Enna and Joliad." "That's not what I mean. The one immediately before that." Irritated, the male wolf narrowed his eyes slightly and shook his head, a few snowflakes falling to the ground. "You told him that foxes killed them all just because his parents would have sired bastards." The dog put him on the right track. "Oh," he said, "you are quite right. That is so not true, for he has begotten the Aramarans with his own mother." Gajaze nodded. "Then let the time go on so that I can correct it." "It's embarrassing that I made such a stupid mistake," the young wolf demanded, but only received another shake of the head from his friend. "You can't do that, Amarok," he said. "And why not?" "Because Banito dreamed it that way 2,000 years ago. It happened and now it can't be changed." This was obviously another one of Chenerah's confusion games and Amarok thought to himself that he had no humor left for this kind of entertainment. "Go ahead. Let it run, then I'll correct what I said and put an end to it," he demanded. "You can't tell him anything other than that sentence. Don't you understand? You appeared to him in his dream and also fragments of your murder of Carteron. Pieces of the future to which you belong. We have arrived at this very place, and for this reason he dreamed it that way." Annoyed, the Samoyeden threw his head back, looked at the sky and sighed loudly. "Oh man. Chenerah, what's with all this complicated talk all the time? Is there nothing clear and unambiguous in your brain?" The shepherd dog approached him and took the wolf's head between his hands. Smiling, he said, "This is exactly the reason for your story. Your story. The reason for the creation of Vulpes Lupus Canis is the disorder in my mind and the desire for clarity and peace in it. Joliad also told me something like that when he appeared to me back then. You in this stupid story. Why is it actually called the Vulpes Lupus Canis?" grumbled the wolf, wanting to know what he was doing here. Couldn't anything be changed about the past? "I'm glad you asked about gender, Amarok. History is Aishi because she is the mother of us all. From her womb we were born. You can't change her anymore, kid, but you can learn from her." "Oh yeah, how?" the Samo asked curiously. "I'll explain. Banito dreamed all those years ago about what has just happened to you and him. And we are at that very moment. Of course, he couldn't do much with it. So you had told him in the dream that the multiplication of his parents would result in bastards who would be responsible for the death of many of your compatriots and your family. Although his mother told him that she and Aram might not be able to produce any more children, he believed what you told him. After all, Arya could have been wrong. However, what I told him was wrong, because I know that he is the reason for the bastards and not Aram." "Very true," praised the elder. "But the fact that you told Banito the way you did led to his psychosis and the rapes to the detriment of his mother." Terrified, the wolf realized, he was now to blame for Arya's son raping her and killing Aram. So I should have told him that he was guilty of crosses from himself and his own mother? No, because then he wouldn't have understood and would have dismissed it as a bad dream. He wouldn't have gotten delusions, he wouldn't have killed Aram, and he wouldn't have raped Arya. So the future would never have happened. Amarok did not understand anything anymore. He sat down in the cold snow and rubbed his arms, shivering. I don't get it, Chenerah, he confessed, resting his head on his bent knees, overwhelmed. When the dog saw this, he looked sad and sat down by his companion, whereupon the latter leaned his head against the Alsatian's shoulder. You can think of it as a paradox, he began to explain. I wrote this part of the story quite early. The you in his dream could not know the truth then. Banito assumed that the mating of his parents would create a cruel future. If you hadn't made that clear to him in the dream, there would be a different future today. Maybe Aram and Arya would have had more puppies, or maybe not. If not, there would not be 7 Jagranate and probably no Aram Arya. To prevent the prophecy from coming true, to prevent his mother from having 7 puppies, Banito took Aram's place. And this, he believed, could only be done by murdering and mating with his mother. After all, you are only married after the act. Amarok contemplated the snowflakes that floated silently in the air and continued to think about what would have happened if the fox people had not existed, well, then without Aram Arya. Suppose Banito had remained the only son, what would be different now? There wouldn't be this stupid war. That would be great. You're succumbing to one of the hardest questions to ask yourself right now, what if? It's hard to explain, but the future and the past overlap at this point. That makes it a paradox, which is very complicated, the dog reminded. Complicated? You don't say? The wolf grumbled, folding his arms. My threat to Banito is to blame for the future happening the way it did. If I had chosen different words, we wouldn't be standing here now and I could never have made that statement? What kind of stupid logic is that? Confusing, yes. But you get the point, there might not have been Aram Arya, maybe not even your friend Joliad. Maybe the other nations on this planet would have occupied the island and the foxes would have been scattered everywhere. The wolf took his head from Chenerah's shoulder and thought, no matter how you spun it, it was a good thing that he and Joliad had spent childhood together and later fallen in love. No matter what suffering Banito's actions had caused. No matter if he, Amarok, was responsible for it. I think whatever happened, things are now the way they are. What we have today, we should use and make the best of it, summed up the Samo and the dog nodded. That is the lesson you should grasp, Amarok, Chenerah affirmed, feeling proud of his companion. I, too, had to learn to deal with the past, as a part of me, not as something to be mourned. Faith in you has made me who I am. And it has made this story possible. Through pain and suffering I have gone just to write these lines and bring you all to life. Both paused, with the sheepdog tenderly petting his wolf and giving him a gentle kiss. I don't understand why you let me go through this again now, Chenerah, he then said sadly. You're the one who's writing this story. Why do you do these things? For order, clarity? Do you realize that you are causing a lot of pain to your creatures? It's selfish, do you know that? That's it. And I am very sorry for that, my wolf, the older male spoke inside. But so, like this sequence here, it has happened. It is written and I cannot change it. That's what I've been trying to explain to you all along. I also wish everything had turned out differently, but it's too late. I can't change anything anymore. I let you go through all this because you should grow and gain knowledge from it. It's all for our strengthening. Understand that. While I don't think my brain is quite up to it, I think inside I understand. Joliad's spirit said you needed my help, we're here alone and wandering around confused. I promised him I would go with you and believe you. I'm glad you think so, the Alsatian smiled, his expression brightening. However, I have to admit, his friend then commented, that this back and forth is not particularly fun. I know. But I had to show you this scene at the center of the story, let you experience it. It was important to me. It's part of the last great insight I can give you along the way. The wolf's head was still full of questions, but he knew that any of them would have complicated everything here. He sometimes felt like the tool of a higher power and other times sovereign and strong. Which one, then, was the real Amarok? Would he ever find himself again? What am I doing with this information? Chenerah? What are you giving it to me for, if it is not to confuse, but to create clarity? Let's walk a bit, little one, the dog spoke without answering the question. I'll show you something in conclusion before we disappear from this timeline. All right. If it must be, the wolf sighed and saw that the surroundings around the two males blurred and became clear again shortly after. Now they were obviously in a different place, because the trees were different. But it was snowing here, too. Damn, it's so cold. The Samo brought out shivering and breathed into his hands to keep them warm. Hold on a little longer, my darling. Because in a moment you will see why it has become so cold in the middle of summer. Get ready for the second part of the greatest insight from my book for you, said his companion, pointing with his finger at someone who was wandering among the snow-covered trees and kept calling for Aram and Banito. Who is that? Asked Amarok, exhaling frozen breath. That's Arya, he got in reply. Come on, let's go after her. Let's keep our distance, though. So Chenerah and his friend followed the mother wolf with all caution and hid behind thick trees again and again, fearing to be seen. After further calls of the she-wolf remained unanswered, Banito suddenly appeared behind her. Hello, mother, he said, audibly to Amarok and Chenerah, at which his mother winced. Banito. You scared me. She shouted, and her pursuers realized that her son's right arm was covered in blood. Banito looked to her and grinned grimly as he hissed with quick words, Get back inside. It's cold outside. Amarok had heard that before. What does that mean, Chenerah? He whispered, but the question was only answered with a quiet shut up. What? Where is your father, Banito? What happened? Asked Arya, her voice sounding anxious. My headache is gone, mother, was the only reply she got as the male turned away from her again and strolled further into the woods. The snowfall was now very thick and the two observers almost lost sight of the hybrid and his mother, but they quickly went after them, hearts pounding. A few meters away, the observers stopped in front of a large deciduous tree that bore peach-like fruit. Hanging from its branches was the body of a fox, cut open lengthwise and drenched in blood, with its head hanging down and its snout open, staring in the direction of Banito and Arya. Its entrails lay on the forest floor in front of it and the snow around it was colored deep red. Amarok understood immediately, the fox there was Aram, Arya's husband, and Banito had killed him. With his jaw dropped, the wolf watched as Arya immediately began to scream and dropping to her knees. She cried, catching her breath again and again, continuing the scream until she lowered her head into the snow and whimpered, Why, Banito? Why? But her son was completely unimpressed and wiped the numerous snowflakes from his muzzle. It's not cold anymore, mother. The whistling sound is gone, no more pain. Arya was obviously devastated and a moment later she stood up, ran towards Banito and screamed, Why did you do that? You murderer. Stunned, Amarok watched as she was intercepted by her son's arms, from which she tried to free herself, punching and kicking. As if in a psychosis, the male answered doggedly and strained, I will not let him continue to turn wolves into foxes. I will take his place as his son. Suddenly he tore his mother's clothes off her body and threw himself lying on top of her in the snow. Stop! Shouted Kesar again, and released Amarok from the time rigidity that had now set in. By the gods! What has he done? Shouted Amarok. Now I'm sure you know why it just got so cold in the middle of summer. Banito killed Aram, and with him the god of the sun. How is it, then, that subsequent summers did not exhibit this unusual behavior? The other wanted to know, whereupon the Alsatian opened to him that Aram had ascended and thus become the sun itself. However, there is one thing very important about his death that you should pay attention to. It is, as I said, the last great realization you must receive in order to understand your world. And which one is that? The tree on which Aram is impaled. Do you recognize the fruit? Asked Kesar, pointing to the branches. These are kopachecas, right? Exactly, agreed the dog. Remember your wolfish tradition of burying your dead along with the kernel of a kopacheca. Now, knowing that Aram's blood has seeped into the ground, it should be clear to you that the effect of these fruits is no accident. The roots of these woody plants are very widely branched, and among the Alsatians it is said that each tree can communicate with the others. You mean they are steeped in the blood, have absorbed it and passed it on to their descendants? That's right, Amarok. You're nowhere near as stupid as you always say you are. It's Aram's blood that makes their effect. And this effect is called realization, both now pronounced at the same time. They are the fruits of knowledge around the world we live in? That's right, Amarok. On Gaja, a similar fruit exists. There it is an apple, which is the fruit of the tree of knowledge. This is at least enshrined in the Christian religion there. Does that mean you're very religious? Amarok wanted to know as the scenery disappeared and the world around them sank into deep black. Well, I certainly know the history of the origin of the Gajans. However, I have created other, own gods with my fictions, if you like. I am a believer, but I only believe in what I want, what I think is right and true. The wolf pondered. He now understood that all this, his world, he and Joliad, was a fiction of Chenerah's that amounted to a creed of its writer. What are you going to do with the story when we will all have lived through it? He wanted to know. I think, the Alsatian mused, I'll leave it in a drawer and then take it to the grave with me someday. Is that what this is all about? Rather not, Chenerah shook his head. However, it was only important to me that what needed to be said was said. I wanted everyone around me to know what was important and sacred to me. And what will happen now? Am I going to die now? The young male asked sadly and the shepherd smiled caringly. No, my friend, he then said, you won't. Not now. You're alive and you just need to wake up. The android turned briskly away from the questioners and beeped, I'll show you if you want. You bet we do, Amarok hissed and clenched his fist, suspecting that he was not to see anything good. The machine led its companions into a separate room, which was pitch black at first, but then flooded with bright light as soon as the group entered. Here you go, progress, it then said cheerfully and continued down a long hallway lined with many cylindrical vessels. Slowly, the wolves followed the robot and looked around in amazement. They could not believe their eyes and all looked stunned, their heads always moving back and forth. The bodies of anthropomorphic beings were visible in containers, stored in a turbid liquid. Some of them had obvious deformities, 6 fingers on each hand, 2 snouts, a missing tail or humps on their backs. They looked terrifying and there must have been several hundred of them placed here. What is all this? Asked Serena, and even she, the strong wolf queen, now had to swallow as her entourage moved slowly and alertly through the hallway. That, Your Majesty, is progress. The machine merely replied, and Amarok could see that passages led from the main corridor to other rooms off to the side. They were all open, each revealing an operating table and associated equipment. There were no wolves lying here that had been operated on, except in one of the last rooms at the end of the corridor. By the gods! Whispered Amarok, his eyes wide open, and started going toward the door. Amarok, don't go in. We don't know what it's about, his queen still ordered, but he couldn't help it, he was in a trance and had to see what was going on in that room. Amarok, come here. We command you. The queen continued to shout, but even now her subject did not respond. Further, the others looked at the cylinders and noticed that these subjects seemed to be partially underdeveloped. Some of them were of puppy age, others were simple embryos. Some were missing limbs or had extremely long teeth. This one lacks eyes, Your Majesty, spoke a soldier, after which his mistress only ordered not to touch anything. She was soon seething with anger inside and tears formed in her eyes. Meanwhile, the young male walked up to the laid-out body of a wolf, which had a bloodied muzzle and was lying there tied up. His eyes were closed and he didn't really look like a Samoyeden as they were known here, he wore very little fur, was almost naked, and his muzzle was extremely short. He almost reminded Amarok more of a Gajan than of one of his kind. Standing very close in front of him and tensely lowering his head above his own, he suddenly chimed in, granted, not all of our experiments were successful. He winced and quickly turned around, his gun ready to fire again. Damn it! Why do you scare me like that? He cursed, yelling at the robot that had approached from behind. When he calmed down a moment later, he hissed, What about him? What have they done to him? Who killed him? Talk, you tin can. But the machine's eyes again formed question mark symbols and it asked, dumbfounded, killed? The Samoyeden, who had at first glared at the android in a very domineering manner and bent his head down to him, now changed his expression. He opened his eyes quite wide, as well as his muzzle, and said only quietly and choppily, "Oh. No." A loud shout of his name from the monarch sounded and he slowly straightened up. In slow motion, he caught sight of the wolf soldiers rushing into the room, leaving Chenerah behind and drawing their weapons. A long exhale followed and full of fear, Amarok slowly turned back to the table where the creature was now kneeling and bared its teeth. The shackles had not been pulled tight and the wolf, or whatever it was, had been able to free itself. Still, as it sat there now, it seemed unreal to Amarok. He had the feeling as if the creature did not breathe, as if it did not have to. The young wolf was rigid with fear, not daring to move an inch. He gulped as the subject snapped open its teeth-barbed muzzle and screeched, spraying saliva in his face. The sound was very high and shrill, and the creature's tongue fluttered as Samos fur blew away. Suddenly, a loud bang sounded and the left half of the creature's head shattered, accompanied by splattering blood and brain matter. One of the soldiers had shot it in the head before anything worse could happen. But even as the strange, gruesome experiment fell sideways back onto the examination table and stopped moving, Amarok sat stunned, shocked and stiff. The face contorted. Smeared with blood. Soaked in saliva. "Are you all right, Amarok?" His queen's face then spoke. She had put her hands to his cheeks and gently moved the head of the shaken male. The latter did not say another word and was trembling slightly when it could be seen that tears were running down his face. "Amarok, say something. Talk to us." I want home, your majesty," he spoke softly, sounding as if he were broken. "Amarok, it is over. The despot is destroyed, you have destroyed him. He can no longer cause such suffering to any wolf. We will have this place cleared, then all will be well," the Wolf Queen promised, but her counterpart did not respond. "He has atoned and we must now look forward. Be sure, it hurts us as much to see all this here. But now the people of this murderer will be brought to justice. We give you our word." But whatever she said, nothing could make the male breathe a sigh of relief. With an impressive calmness he stood in front of her, started to move. As if frozen, he looked through Chenerah and the other wolves and past them unhindered. Questioningly, the soldiers shied at their leader, but she only shook her head silently. They should let the young wolf go, clear this vault and burn everything here, including the crippled results of numerous, shameful atrocities, she ordered. This vault should be kept under lock and key so that no one would ever enter it again. For a moment, Amarok's compatriots looked after him and he did not dare to turn around again after passing through the big metal gate. He never wanted to come back here again and they could all take care of their war and killing alone from now on. His head was empty and the silence in it gave way more and more to bewilderment at what he had just witnessed. With drooping shoulders, sad expression and bowed head, he walked home, ignoring the beautiful weather and the friendly chirping birds. After all, there was no war for them, not even here in Arimaria. He didn't want to talk to anyone anymore. He wanted to be alone, for himself. What kind of world was this, in which he had already lived all these years, without suspecting what outrages were happening here around him, yes, even under his nose? What would Joliata have felt, what would he have said about it? Shortly before he arrived home, the wolf made a detour at a liquor store, packed 1, 2, 3 bottles of Copac into a bag and strolled on his way. He needed this stuff now, needed to drown his sorrows, to displace what he had experienced and to numb his pain. Before Amarok knew it, he found himself in the arms of the dog that carried him away, accompanied by the Wolf Queen. "We have to get out of here. We're losing him," the Alsatian shouted and hurried down the hallway of the building. His friend, woozy and in pain, was unable to speak and tried to keep his eyes open. However, he was so tired and saw images of his fox in front of him, smiling and making a welcoming hand gesture as the world around him turned more and more into silhouettes. His time seemed to have come and every weight slowly disappeared from his shoulders. He felt light now, and the trudging footsteps of his bearer grew duller and duller. So he let himself fall and closed his eyes. "Quick, let's go to the transport tube." The dog shouted and ran purposefully to the supply room. "How do you know exactly where it is?" Chenerah wanted to know, but the other just waved it off. "I'll explain it to you later." Now there was nothing left of the nobility of the she-wolf and she became almost panic-stricken, was no longer as confident and calm as usual. Hastily she opened the tube and shouted to the Kesar, Quick, in with him. We have to get to our palace. It's safe there. The dog gently placed Amarok in the tube and could hear how the shooting continued in the square in front of the building. Many screams and painful wails turned this place into a scene of horror, and this meant that the killing and dying would continue even after the official end of the conflict. Originally, transport tubes were designed to carry one person from one place to another. Accordingly, it was cramped in here for 3. Everything inside them when they were released was sent unchanged to the chosen tube at the destination. This worked, unlike the Aramaran mobile beamers, even without a network connection to the former headquarters. Hold on, my wolf. We're almost there, Gajaze pleaded, and Chenerah hastily typed the coordinates of her palace in Luna into the console. The transport ended and quickly they and the shepherd dog ran up the stone steps to the entrance. Here, several maids already met them and took the unconscious wolf from them. Take care of him. Take him to the healing bath, quickly. The monarch ordered. Chenerah was out of breath and snorted as the maids carried Amarok briskly down the hall and disappeared with him into a room. Where are they taking him? The dog asked, regaining his composure. We have a healing bath here. That should help him, dear Lord Sovereign, the she-wolf explained. I'm going after him. I can't possibly leave him alone now. We understand, Chenerah agreed, nodding. We'd have to freshen up first, though. It was all very tiring after all. The dog smiled, for this was the Chenerah, the wolf queen he knew. Her elegance and grace were back, as was her style and otherwise unwavering etiquette. When Chenerah arrived at the bathroom, he found that it was fully clad in marble slabs. In the center of the room was a recess in the floor, into which a milky liquid was now being fed through numerous channels in the floor. Quickly the bath filled up and the Kesar helped the ladies to put Amarok into it. He had already been stripped of his clothes and so the extent of the bullet wound was visible. What happens to the bullet inside him? The male asked. It will be repelled from the body as soon as the wounds begin to close, my lord, spoke one of the maids, adding shortly, my lord, you are equally injured. You should sit in it as well. The Alsatian noticed that he had received a deep cut on his right hand and now dipped it into the pit as a test after kneeling next to Amarok. His hand began to tingle as soon as the liquid touched the wound, first becoming warm and then numb. Gajaze had not expected this and, startled, pulled his hand out of the liquid so that it splashed and the rest of it seemed to be abruptly absorbed by his hand. Immediately the spot was dry again and, amazed, the dog could see that the cut had already begun to close again. What is this magic? He asked, fascinated, looking at his hand. Well, this world holds many things, dear Kesar, Chenerah's voice rang out. He stood up, turned to her and asked what this liquid was that the bath was filled with. This is a mixture of the sap of the kopachecas and their woody plants. There are also some oils and pajaka milk in it. It is an old recipe. A hand-me-down from our ancestors. The sheepdog turned his head toward Amarok and spoke thoughtfully to himself, how is it that I know less and less of what is going on? The story has slipped away from me. What do you mean? Asked the regent. Nothing, it's nothing. I was just thinking out loud, your majesty. Very well. We suggest that you also sit inside for a while we go discuss the current situation with our council members, Chenerah advised and her counterpart nodded. When she had gone, the male began to undress, accompanied by quiet giggling of the servants. Oh, he, whispered the fawns, furtively glancing at the dog's body, which, however, left him cold. He seemed to go down well with female anthros, Kesar knew. However, he didn't care about fawns, because after all, he had fallen in love with Amarok. Sighing loudly, he let himself sink into the warm milk and sat down next to his friend, who seemed to be asleep and visibly breathing, which relieved the Alsatian. Thank the gods we made it in time, Amarok, he spoke softly, giving the wolf a kiss on the cheek. Get a good rest. You'll be fine. After Chenerah had stroked Amarok for a while, he too now leaned back and relaxed completely. He felt a pleasant tingling sensation all over his body, which told him that the liquid was doing its job. Slowly the cuts that the glass had inflicted on him closed and he became drowsy. Finally, a little rest, leaving everything behind, in safety and without a fight. Soon his breathing slowed, and he began to dream. He was standing in a bright room where there was a bed on which a human man was lying. The dog recognized him immediately and quickly made the decision to talk to him, virtually himself in human form, about the Vulpes Lupus Canis. Something was not right anymore, and for some time Chenerah had the feeling of having lost control. Things were happening that he hadn't written down, and he had to ask this human what had gone wrong so that all these events were occurring that shouldn't be there. For example, who had shot Automak? "Hello, I'm Christian," I spoke, feeling weak and tired. "I know," Kesar confirmed, nodding tearfully. "What are you doing here?" "Here in my dream?" he asked, his legs trembling. "I'm just waiting for you, my dog," I explained, feeling that my lips were swollen and my eyes were in tears. "Come to me, sit down," I offered, tapping the seat of the vacant chair with my pale hand. "What did you do?" the male asked, a heavy lump tightening his throat. He sat down as I just smiled and sighed. "Do you know what is there, amidst the darkness that enters when the spirit leaves the body?" I asked, gently stroking the Alsatian's soft hand. He sadly lowered his head and murmured, "No, I don't know." "I saw it, Chenerah." "And there is nothing." The male looked at me and asked why the history in which he lived had changed so much. Much eventually happened, although he did not remember ever writing it that way. "I have created you, my dog," I spoke softly and smiled, which, however, made him look questioningly. "And so," I added, "you are now free to decide and are no longer dependent on any written words." Now he understood and sighed. "So you mean everything that happens from now on is not what was written down by me, that is, by you?" "Exactly," I confirmed, nodding. "And it has been since the moment I had Amarok and Josiah, a friend of Joliad's, meet so that they could make a plan for an uprising." "What? I don't know anything about that," exclaimed the Alsatian in shock. With my free hand, I reached for a stack of the many pieces of paper that lay on my nightstand. "This, my dog, is a written part of the Vulpes Lupus Canis, of which I am the architect," I opined, holding out the slips of paper to him. "Strictly speaking, this is from the second part, the middle of which we are just crossing." That's what I told Amarok when I gave him the final insight in his dream. "I know. And I don't want you to be able to do those things anymore, which is why I forbid you. You no longer have the ability to influence the thoughts and actions of others. At least not in that way. But, I am you. How can it be that I don't know how the story goes on? Wasn't it my job to fill the Vulpes Lupus Canis with meaning and values?" The male asked confusedly and took the stack of papers. "It is time for you to understand that this task has slipped away from you. It has slipped away from us." From page 100. "Give yourself time, and this realization will work on you." Tensely, Gajaze turned to the 100th page. He read silently and spellbound. At first he seemed very composed, but as he went on he became more and more bewildered and irritated. While the dog read, I looked out the window and watched a pair of birds preparing a nest in the branches of a tree. For all of them, life would go on, even new things would emerge. I didn't even know if I would be able to tell anyone else the end of my story. With each passing day, I had the feeling that I was getting weaker. Breakable. Delicate. Fragile. I was not only as fragile as glass, but just as transparent. Today, anyone could have asked me about my most intimate secrets, I would have told everything, because there was nothing left to lose. It was an interesting feeling to know that, in the face of a hopeless situation, one could always be courageous, to tell people with a raised middle finger what one had always wanted to tell them. My musing was interrupted by my protagonist's voice. "I don't know this passage." "How is that possible?" "I have made all three of you, Joliad, Amarok and you, free beings. You are not the one who has to make the decisions regarding history, but I am. There may be no God for me, but there is for you." "I don't know now," Kesar began, "what to do in this world. I always thought you would let me work in your place in these situations." "It's been that way, too, until now," I smiled, stroking the fur of the dog's head. "And I must say that, basically, you've done very well. But now it's time for you, as well as Amarok, to make a final realization in the middle of your story." Chenerah visibly enjoyed my touch and kept his eyes closed as he asked what realization that was supposed to be. "You can't control everything and now you just have to let things happen." Make the best of it and find your way. I won't tell any of you what to do anymore. Joliade went his own way at the end of his short life. While I don't think he realized it, his decision to strike down Carteron changed the whole story. In the beginning, you had a sense of control. Now, though, you realize you've lost it. The male opened his eyes again and returned my gaze. How I loved his eyes. So, I guess I lost control at the end of Joliade's life? I thought so. No, I replied, shaking my head, that happened much earlier. Do you remember when you and Joliade visited me on Gaja? You stood in my room and watched me write. You explained to Joliade that your whole world came from my imagination, and tapped me on the head. At that moment, you and I could see each other. The male remembered the situation and nodded. Now I understand. You looked me straight in the eye. Of course. And I like your eyes very much. I must say that you turned out very well for me. As masculine and sexy as I dreamed you would be. What I would have given to be in your skin for just a moment. Now the Alsatian grinned. I am honored that you find me attractive. Even though you are human, I feel a certain affection. It's not sexual in nature, because it wasn't meant to be. It's more like a love between father and son, or between two friends, brothers maybe. Right? After a short pause, during which we looked wordlessly into each other's eyes, I could no longer hold back and asked the male to give me a kiss goodbye. What, I'm supposed to? Just one, my dog. It's our last meeting, I think. I want to finally feel what it feels like to kiss one of your kind. All right, but only if you tell me how it should go on for me now in your story. If I can't direct it anymore, at least help me a little. I can't. It's up to you now, Chenerah, I denied, which saddened the Alsatian. I didn't want to hurt him or leave him out in the cold, so after a moment's thought I relented. All right. I'll tell you one thing. It's a spoiler. So don't say I didn't warn you. Gajaze nodded joyfully, after which I opened to him. The war will end and turn to peace, among other things, through a descendant of the Wolf Queen. What? Who would get her pregnant? You know what she's like. I don't think anyone would even dare think about having sex with her. Ha ha, I laughed. Yes, I know what she's like. I know her very well. However, you can guess that she too is just a fawn with needs. She will do, I assure you, my dog. But with whom? In due time, you will know. Now, be true to your word and pay the agreed price. We both closed our eyes and I received a romantic kiss that felt so unique, different and beautiful that I somewhat regretted having to let my protagonist wake up again. Chenerah twitched and was startled, after which he opened his eyes and was awake again. He looked around and noticed that Amarok was no longer sitting next to him. Amarok! He shouted and quickly got out of the milk. This was absorbed into his body in a flash, as it had been before, and he was immediately dry, so that he could get dressed again. The male ran down the hall, calling his companion's name over and over. Where was he? Where were the maids and Serena? How long had he been asleep? The next moment, a servant appeared in front of him and asked, "Please do not shout so loudly, dear sir. The Queen and your friend are there, in the blue salon. It is dinner time. We have set the table for you as well, my good sir." He pointed to a door and the sheepdog stepped through. In a room decorated in shades of blue, Serena sat at a large table and had it richly laid. Amarok, who had been sitting opposite her before, now stood up and rejoiced. "Chenerah!" he shouted joyfully, and threw himself into the dog's arms. "Amarok, how are you?" the latter wanted to know and hugged his friend tightly. "Ow!" The wolf groaned and contorted his face, whereupon they quickly let go of each other. "The external damage has healed, faithful Amarok. But it will take 2 or 3 more treatments for the milk to repair your bones as well," the Wolf Queen explained, standing up and making an offering hand gesture. "Take a seat, Lord Sovereign, and eat with us." The Alsatian nodded and sat down at the table, as did his friend. "Do you know what happened yesterday, Your Majesty?" The older male wanted to know and started eating. "Some wine," the regent only spoke and nobly raised her glass, whereupon a servant quickly filled it with red wine. "My queen, do you know what was going on? Why was there a sudden shooting, and by whom?" Amarok wanted to know. She sighed. Our sources told us yesterday that it must have been a young fox who, for no reason at all and completely out of the blue, pulled out a gun and fired at Automac Carteron. Then one thing led to another, panic broke out, resulting in several deaths and injuries. I thought so, Chenerah nodded, for he remembered his dream. He had read a passage there in which Amarok commanded a fox to take advantage of the situation and cause a commotion. What do you mean? His friend asked. Amarok, I know you told this Josiah to cause trouble. He had a gun and you let him run around with it among all those people. What? Yes, but I didn't mean to. The male wolf stuttered. What did you think would happen? When we told Automac to speak to his people from the balcony. You should have stopped him by then at the latest. Excuse me? Explain that, Amarok. Exclaimed the queen, visibly angry. She quickly stood up and slapped her hands loudly on the table, causing her wine glass to fall. Quickly her servant set out and submissively removed the shards. Inwardly it boiled in the she-wolf. If what the Kesar said there was true, it would have been Amarok who was responsible for this misery. A wolf? That simply could not be true. Meekly, Amarok admitted that he had met Chucky and arranged with him to signal him to start a commotion. He wasn't supposed to just shoot off. It wasn't arranged that way, he said sadly and with tear-filled eyes. Shit on the clouds of the gods. You've ruined everything, Amarok. Exclaimed Chenerah, clutching his forehead. Serena shied away with her muzzle wide open, stunned, unable to believe what she was hearing. This can't be true, Amarok. Are you serious? You are responsible for the fact that the war will probably continue now? Now the young wolf jumped up, because he had enough of their blame. So what? He shouted. I didn't tell him to kill the dictator. He decided for himself. I didn't give him a sign for any action. I couldn't know that he would take advantage of Carteron's appearance on the balcony. How could I? Damn you, wolf! Shouted the Alsatian, who had now jumped up as well. You knew what he was like and what he was going to do. He was just waiting for someone like you to strike out. Wait a minute. You can only know about it because you wrote that crappy story. Why didn't you do anything about it? The younger man asked, his arms crossed expectantly. I didn't know about your agreement. Not even about your meeting, the dog admitted. Bullshit. You're the one writing all this stuff. Are you kidding me? I thought you were so divine and infallible. Be quiet. The monarch suddenly shouted, and promptly the males sat down again. What are you talking about, Amarok? What story does he mean, Lord Kesar? What does it mean? Serena also sat down and now had her arms crossed. Your Majesty, it's complicated. A long story, the dog began. Well, we have time. You should explain yourselves before we execute you both for the guilt of continuing the war, she threatened. Take note, meanwhile, Fox's face is in the media. He claims that a wolf named Amarok put him up to it. He was arrested, and now he meekly admits publicly that he planned this attack long ago, along with you, Amarok. What? What is this? That's not true. The defendant exclaimed, stunned. Chenerah concurred, that's a fucking lie. But the queen only repeated, then you should explain immediately what all this has to do with you and your history and how you are involved. Do not think that we are dependent on a trial or a conviction. You're not in your mountains here, dog. This was already a harsh threat. The queen had just said that she would have the Kesar, the first of the Alsatians, executed without any trial or examination. Gajaze knew her and was sure, what Serena said there, she did not say in anger. She spoke about the fear carefully, because she knew about her possibilities. After all, they were in Samojaja and a simple rumor about the fall of Amarok and Chenerah in the war would have been enough in these times. If it was difficult for the Alsatian to make the Wolf Queen believe that he was the author of a story in which they all played only a fictitious role, he nevertheless tried. He told his listener what he had also explained to Joliard and Amarok some time ago. Meanwhile, the mistress kept shaking her head slowly, and after the dog finished his revelation after a few minutes, she sighed loudly. We do not believe a word you say, dear Chenerah. You should, Your Majesty. With all due respect. For it is the truth, even if it is very difficult to understand. Amarok, she then said, what do you say to this? Is it true what your companion said? The wolf nodded. Serena was still suspicious and then asked, so if that's the case, Kesar, hypothetically, why don't you answer your friend's question? What do you think, Your Majesty? If you are going to be the great scribe, the architect of this world and all the events in it, you must have known about all that was coming and that the young fox, this Josiah, was going to go crazy. We agree with Amarok on that. Why didn't you intervene? Now the dog turned his eyes to his wolf and spoke of his dream of the last night. He has released me from all this. I lost more and more control over this story a very long time ago and didn't want to admit it. Now I live like you do. What happens, happens. Nothing I can do about it anymore. It's true, Amarok. You did affect my dream, though, right after I got shot. That's right. And I'm glad I was still able to do that. You now know how this world works in its fundamentals. I knew you wouldn't die. That's why I showed you the origin of everything. Serena took the floor again and interrupted the dialogue. Well, if we assume that this story is true as well, Lord Sovereign, then you now have your back to the wall as well as we and our people. Again Gajaze nodded silently. What has been said sounds so supernatural and impossible that it must be true. We do not believe that you would think up something so great just to deceive us. However, proof would be very beneficial to my goodwill towards you. Surely you understand that. What am I going to give her? What am I going to show her? Thought Gajaze, looking questioningly at her and at Amarok. What would suffice as proof? What had been said should no longer be enough. Stop! He suddenly exclaimed, but nothing happened. Time did not stop as he was used to and the Queen gave him an incredulous look. Crap! Thought the Alsatian and clenched his fist, because he couldn't do that either after his dream. Have you, he began confidently, ever eaten a kopacheca, Your Majesty? What do you mean? She only asked, and Amarok didn't seem to understand what the older male was getting at either. Tell me, have you ever eaten any of these fruits? The monarch smiled. Now that you mention it, no, we have never tasted a kopacheca. At most, the brew made from them is well known to us. Wolves generally don't taste fruit the way foxes do. Only in combination with other juices is theirs drinkable at all for Samoyedans. As you surely know, it is due to the different taste buds on our tongues. Yes, for the wolves, some realizations are probably a bit more bitter and harder to swallow, Chenerah mused aloud. Amarok still didn't understand and probed. What do you mean, Chenerah? Get me such a fruit and then please eat it, Your Majesty, he demanded. The Queen laughed. You want to give us proof of what you said by letting us bite into this inedible thing? You must be out of your mind. Nothing could make us do that. Amarok, what is wrong with your spouse? But sire, spoke the young wolf, widening his eyes, how would you know that the kopacheca is inedible? Everyone knows that, my dear subject, she said, turning her head away. Well, it is what has been told for ages, my queen. What if it's not true? What if these parts taste good to the wolves, too? That's exactly what I mean, the shepherd agreed, looking pleased. In all this time, I have never once mentioned in my book that a wolf has ever eaten one of these fruits pure. Consequently, none ever has. Now the monarch looked interested and hastily flicked her finger several times with her hand raised. Servant! She shouted, without averting her fascinated gaze from the sovereign. Bring us a kopacheca. Of course, Your Majesty. Immediately. A servant shouted, returning after a few moments and holding out a rosy, peach-like fruit to the regent. She took it in her hand and looked at it closely. To Serena, this was just some fruit, an object used exclusively to make kopake. There was no other use for them. Admittedly, they were beautiful to look at and invited one to taste them, but no wolf would ever have dared to do so. They say it's the alcohol that makes them taste sweet. Without it, they are a waste. Some even speak of a lethal effect. Again, you now expect us to bite into a potentially deadly food? Do you want to kill us? Is that it? Speak up, Lord Kesar. But Your Majesty. A poison murder? Spoke the male. That would be indelicate. Besides, true males fight face to face with blades. Poison, after all, is more for sexually neglected fawns. Immediately, the regent's features slipped, and images flashed through her mind. When she met with Radovan Carteron a few years ago to negotiate the progress of the war, he had said exactly the same thing to her. Now, too, a handsome male sat across from her, looking smug and having begun to chew on a piece of meat with relish. It's not possible, she thought to herself, wondering how this dog could know about this very sentence of the leader. But he recognized her confusion and only remarked, I told you that I am the designer of all this. Do you believe me now? Amarok, meanwhile, was amazed. He was not familiar with this dialogue, but he too saw that his friend's statement seemed to leave a deep impression on his queen. Chenerah, I don't understand, he said, earning a hand gesture from his friend to be quiet. Eat, your majesty, commanded the dog, and you will see what the truth is. Serena felt queasy when she saw the Kopacheka again and her hand trembled slightly. Should she really bite into it now? Servants! She shouted, and immediately someone rushed over. If we should die of this, see to it that these two are properly punished. Very well, your majesty. All right, we trust you. What will occur once we have bitten into it? Well, Chenerah explained, you're going to get a little tired. Try them. I assure you that no harm will come to you. You have my word. Pa, the word of a dog. She blasphemed, trying to cover her insecurity. And you have mine as well, Amarok now interjected. I am your most loyal subject, and you know that I would never harm you. But you have never eaten anything like this. How can you give us your word? I trust the word of this Alsatian. Not because he is my friend or lover. I trust him because he has shown me again and again the power he has and that what he says is always true. For a brief moment Serena thought and then decided, very well. Whatever is hereby directed, we follow your recommendation. With eyes narrowed convulsively and accompanied by an astonished look from her butler, she bit off a large piece of the fruit and chewed on it. A very sweet taste caressed her tongue and her palate felt that soft texture underpinned by cold liquid, a sweet juice that tasted better than any wine she had ever had before. It tastes excellent. She was still marveling, only to slump down and sit motionless in her chair with dilated pupils. The Kopacheka fell from her hand and she did not move, but her breathing was steady and shallow.